What is up, my friend? Welcome back to the basement. I am Mikey Henninger. This is Basement Brewed Fantasy Football, my mom and your mom's favorite fantasy football podcast. This is episode 21 of the Basement Brewed Fantasy Football podcast, and today we are going to dive into the Week 10 NFL slate, and we're going to cover one player from every single game that I either like, love, or can just plain old tolerate from a fantasy football standpoint. The Week 10 lineup setting heat map is done. It's complete. I've written up over 250 to 300 players, so I like to think I have my finger on the pulse of pretty much anybody that you might be considering in your lineups. And today we're going to cover one player from each team. But before we do that, it's been a long day. I'm recording this thing at 9:28 p.m. on Thursday night, the 10th. I'm going to pop open a chocolate coffee peanut butter porter from Copper State Brewing, which is a brewery up in Green Bay that my wife and I went to when we went to a Packer game a couple weeks back, and I had this at the brewery, and it was just delicious, so I had to get a 4-pack of it. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube, or if you're listening on podcasts, I'm showing this thing off on YouTube. Chocolate Coffee Peanut Butter Porter by Copper State Brewing. So I'm about to pour this into a glass, and it's going to look very weird, but I'm doing this on purpose. Don't question whether or not I can pour a beer. I bartended for years. I know how to pour a beer. But on the back of this can, it says, "Don't be gentle, pour it like you mean it." And there's literally a picture of them crossing off how you would typically pour a beer, where you tip the glass and tip the beer and go nice and slow so that you get good head. Giggity. And then the picture that they actually encourage is literally the beer itself straight up and down going into the glass. So I'm going to pour this weird. Don't get in my DMs. Don't get in my mentions asking me if I know how to pour a beer. I do. But I got my handy dandy fancy basement brewed fantasy football glass. Shout out to a good friend of mine, Alicia. All right, let's pour this thing. All right, that worked out well. I mean, it's got a ton of head. That didn't really work at all, so this can lied to me. But anyway, really good beer. If you're ever in Green Bay, definitely stop by Copper State Brewing Company. Frankly, the other beers that I had weren't that terrific, but the chocolate coffee peanut butter porter was awesome. It's a great end of night beer. Obviously, you can't drink too many of these during the day if you're like me, but end of night, very good. All right. So let's dive into this thing. Like I mentioned, the Week 10 heat map is complete. This is a tool. This is a resource that 250 plus of my subscribers are using each and every week when they are making difficult start-sit decisions, when they're setting their DFS lineups. A ton of them actually even use it for player prop bets. So we're going to start. We'll skip the Falcons-Panthers game because that's happening literally as we speak. I have no idea what the score is or what's going on in that thing. But we're going to start out with the Seahawks-Buccaneers game, which is going to be in Germany. It's got a 44.5 point over-under. The Buccaneers are expected to win by 2.5 points, which gives each team an implied total of... Seahawks have an implied total of 21. The Buccaneers' implied total is 23.5. Okay, so nothing particularly noteworthy or remarkable about the game script itself or what to expect. It's pretty much business as usual for both teams. Now, the first person I'm going to mention one player from every single game, and the one player I wanted to highlight here is Chris Godwin. Okay, so after 6 games since Chris Godwin returned, he's averaging an amazingly consistent 12.7 PPR points per game, 10.3 targets, 6.5 catches, 61.5 yards, and he has no touchdowns yet on the season. Now, that's noteworthy because with 409 yards on the season, but no touchdowns, Chris Godwin appears in third place. He's number 3 on my list of positive touchdown regression candidates that all 250 plus of my subscribers have access to every week. It's a cheat sheet that I put together that basically showcases mathematically who is and is not likely to score touchdowns And Chris Godwin is number 3 on that list with 409 yards, but no touchdowns to show for it. The league average for similar yardage marks, by the way, is about 2.9 touchdowns, and Godwin is sitting at 0. I think this is a great spot. He has a great opportunity to cash in on that regression. He has been as consistent as he could possibly be. He has scored at least 10 PPR points in each of the last 6 games he's played, including 5 games in between 10 and 14 PPR points. So he still isn't quite scratching that ceiling, which isn't a surprise considering he hasn't scored any touchdowns yet. I am trading him as a volume-based and regression-enhanced wide receiver 2, but it is a pretty difficult matchup this week. The Seahawks have been tough on wide receivers. They're holding wide receivers to the 5th fewest PPR points, the 9th fewest catches, the 3rd fewest yards, 8th fewest touchdowns, and just 4 wide receivers in 9 games have been able to reach 15 or more PPR points against the Seahawks, including just 1 that has been able to hit 15 in the last 4 games. Moving over, so Chris Godwin, it's a difficult matchup, but I'm trading him as a wide receiver 2, and I think he has a good chance of scoring a touchdown this week. All right, moving over to the Lions-Bears game. It has a 48.5 over-under, which is among the highest on the 14-game slate. The Bears are favored by 2.5 points. The Bears have an implied total of 25.5 points, and the Lions have an implied total of 23 points. So it should be a relatively high-scoring game. This is one that I plan on targeting in DFS tournaments this coming weekend. Nothing particularly noteworthy about the game script, but the high over-under does indicate that this is a game that you want to target. This is a game that you want to get into your lineups wherever you can. Okay. The player that I want to mention here is probably an obvious one after last week's eruption, Justin Fields. And you know what? Because it's obvious, I won't go that route. Let's go somewhere else. I'll go with Darnell Mooney. I just got to find him here on my heat map because that wasn't the plan. So let me search Darnell Mooney. There he is. All right. So Darnell Mooney. So obviously we know Darnell got off to a painfully slow start in the season, but he's slowly but surely picking up the production as of late. Over his last 7 games, Darnell Mooney is averaging 10.9 PPR points per game, 6.71 targets, 4.29 catches, 57.6 yards, and he has 1 touchdown. Once again, just like Chris Godwin, Darnell Mooney finds himself on the positive touchdown regression list as well. He has 409 yards, but he only has 1 touchdown to show for it. Now, the caveat is he is pretty low on the list. He's down around 13th on the list, but he is on the list. With 409 yards and just 1 touchdown, the league average for similar yardage marks is about 2.9 touchdowns. So he's about 1.9 behind where he's supposed to, quote unquote, behind where he's supposed to be. Okay. Now, over those last 7 games, Darnell Mooney has averaged 3 games under 9 PPR points, but he also has 4 games over 12 or more PPR points, including last week's season high, which is 17.3. He has 12 or more PPR points in 3 of his last 4 games, and as the Bears offense continues to look better and better and frankly become an elite unit in the NFL. I mean, they're implied for 25.5 points this week. They're definitely starting to climb the ranks in the NFL. Mooney is going to continue to produce. Now, yes, Chase Claypool was just acquired, and he did play 35% on the snaps last week, and he figures to get more and more acquainted with the offense as time goes on. But Mooney is still going to get plenty of opportunities in a quickly ascending offense. And another positive, an optimistic way you can look at it is Darnell Mooney was never really meant to be a wide receiver 1. So with Claypool in town, Mooney gets to be the wide receiver 2, which might get him some more favorable matchups moving forward. I'm trading Darnell Mooney as a wide receiver 3 with some shoot up, matchup, and regression enhanced upside. There's a lot that's working in his favor as far as upside goes. The Lions are getting smashed by wide receivers. They're allowing the 6th most PPR points per game, the 8th most catches, the 5th most yards, and the 8th most touchdowns. 11 different wide receivers in just 8 games have been able to dump 15 or more PPR points on the Detroit Lions. 6 of them broke into the 20s, including Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, who each put up 30-plus in the same game. Moving over to the Browns and Dolphins. This over-under is even higher at 49.5. The Dolphins are favored by 3. The Dolphins' implied total is 26.25. The Browns' implied total is 23.25. Again, this is a high over-under. It's one of the highest. It looks like it's the second highest on the entire slate. This is a game to target and get into your fantasy football lineups wherever you can. In this game, I wanted to zoom in on, I really want to zoom in on Tyreek Hill, largely for a lot of the same reasons. Let me just touch on this real quick. I won't dive into my full analysis. You can check it out in the heat map if you're curious, but hopping over to the regression sheet real quick, Tyreek Hill comes in at number 1 on the touchdown regression sheet. This guy has 1,129 yards from scrimmage, but he has just 3 touchdowns. Just 3. Okay, so the league average for a similar yardage mark, which isn't a lot, and I went conservative here, is 5.9 touchdowns, and Tyreek Hill has only 3, and he's leading the league in scrimmage yards, if I'm not mistaken. The other one that I'll highlight instead of Tyreek Hill, because he's obvious. It's not like you're not going to start Tyreek Hill. So let's talk about Jeff Wilson instead. That's somebody who's kind of he's kind of on the line. You're not 100% sure if you want to start him. In his first game in Miami, Jeff Wilson surprisingly outsnapped Raheem Mostert, 49-47%. He out-touched him 12-9, out-targeted him 3-2, out-caught him 3-0, outgained him 72 yards to 26, and he outscored him 16.2 PPR points to 8.6 PPR points. Now, that was a surprise because Mostert has been playing well all season up to this point, and this was Wilson's first game with Miami, even though he had only been with the team for a few days. Now, yes, he already knew Mike McDaniel's playbook, but to still come in and immediately unseat the incumbent starter who had been playing well up to this point, it was largely a surprise to anybody, and it indicated a possible changing of the guard, but it probably created more questions than answers in Miami. I'm moving forward as if Wilson is the lead back in Miami, but I assume, and everybody should largely assume, that Raheem Mostert figures to remain involved. It's not likely that he's just going to go away, and more likely than not, this is going to turn into one of those committees that doesn't really allow either one to have significant fantasy value where they're able to reach their ceiling. But as the lead back on a home-favored team that's expected to score a lot of points in a great matchup, Wilson is best treated as a RB2 with some upside. Raheem Mostert is probably better treated as an RB3 with upside because of how great the matchup is. The Browns have held opposing running backs to the 16th fewest touches and the 13th fewest receiving yards, but other than that, they have absolutely hemorrhaged production to running backs. They are allowing the 4th most PPR points per game, the 15th most catches, the 8th most rushing yards, 11th most scrimmage yards, 2nd most touchdowns, and 6 different running backs in 8 games have been able to reach 15 or more PPR points against the Brownies, including 2 that have been able to hit 25. So, long term, this backfield could be maddening. It could be a headache, but this week in particular, I think Jeff Wilson carries a lot of value as an RB2. In the Jaguars-Chiefs game, this game has the highest over-under on the entire 14-game slate at 51 points. The Chiefs are favored by 9.5 points, so over 2 scores. The Chiefs have an implied total of a whopping 30.25 points, meaning get as many Kansas City Chiefs into your lineup as you can, because there's going to be touchdowns here. And the Jaguars' implied total is 20.75. Personally, and I say personally, so take this with a grain of salt, because I'm trying to keep this analytical and data and stacks and fact focused, not my personal opinion. But personally, I do think the Jaguars team total's too low. I think they have a good chance of actually putting up some points and making this thing a real shootout. Jaguars-Chiefs, that's a game that I intend to stack heavily in man, that beer is good. Stack heavily in DFS tournaments. The person that I'm going to call out here is I'm actually going to go away from the Chiefs, and I'm going to call out literally the entire Jaguars offense. I like Trevor Lawrence. I like Travis Etienne. I like Christian Kirk. I think Zay Jones and Marvin Jones are good deep plays. I think Evan Ingram is a great tight end streamer. The one that I'm going to zoom in on for the purposes of today's episode is Christian Kirk. So let me do a quick Control F, find where he is on the map. There he is. Christian Kirk. So after 9 games in Duval, Christian Kirk is averaging 14.5 PPR points per game, 7.8 targets, 4.8 catches, 63.8 yards, and he has 5 different touchdowns. That doesn't even make sense. He has 5 touchdowns. He's scored 12 or more PPR points in 6 of 9 games this season, including 2 games where he has scored 21 or more PPR points. So flashing a nice solid floor, a nice high ceiling. I'm considering him a wide receiver 2/3, kind of at the bottom end of wide receiver 2s. He's got a lot of upside for more in what's likely to be a very, very pass-heavy approach and a great matchup. The Jaguars being 9.5 point underdogs implies a very negative game script that indicates they're going to have to throw a lot more than they would probably like to. It's going to be a very pass-heavy approach as they try to keep up or even catch up to the Kansas City Chiefs. So it should be heavy pass volume, and it's a great matchup for Christian Kirk. The Chiefs are getting absolutely smacked by wide receivers. They are allowing the 7th most PPR points, 9th most catches, 8th most yards, and 2nd most touchdowns. 8 different wide receivers in 8 games have been able to reach 15 or more PPR points against the Chiefs, including 4 different wide receivers that have been able to hit 25. Okay. Moving on to the Texans-Giants, from the highest over-under to one of the lowest over-unders. Texans at Giants has a 41-point over-under. The Giants are favored by 4, which gives the Texans an implied total of 18.5 and the Giants an implied total of 22.5. The spread is narrow enough that there isn't any reason to complicate things in terms of teams' approaches. We should still expect the Texans to run the ball and give Dameon Pierce the ball as much as he can. Whereas the person that I want to highlight in this one, and my number 2 favorite play on the entire slate on any team in any situation, is Saquon Barkley. He is set up to absolutely feast in this game. After 8 games, Mr. Barkley is averaging 19.4 PPR points, 23.9 touches, 4.4 targets, 3.5 catches, 121 scrimmage yards, and he has 5 touchdowns. Saquon has scored 15 or more PPR points in 7 out of the last 8 games this season, including each of the last 6. He hasn't hit 20 PPR points since week 3, but he has a really good chance of changing that this week. He is a home-favored running back, which usually implies volume, right? Being a 4-point favorite means the Giants can feed him as much as they want to, theoretically. He's on a team that's expected to score a decent amount of points, which implies scoring opportunities. He's already getting plenty of volume, and he gets the best possible matchup that a running back could possibly get in fantasy football this year against a league-worst Houston Texans defense. Saquon is, this week, he's an elite high-end RB1. There's only one player I would take over him, which we'll get to shortly. The Texans have held running backs to the 15th fewest catches, but otherwise they have been absolutely slaughtered by running backs this year. Just completely obliterated. They are allowing the most PPR points per game, the most touches, the most rushing yards, the 16th most receiving yards, the most scrimmage yards, and the most touchdowns. They are giving up 1.6 touchdowns to running backs every single game. 6 running backs in 8 games have been able to reach 15 PPR points against these Texans. 5 of them, 5 different performances of 27 or more PPR points. The Texans have played 8 games, and 5 running backs have been able to hit 27 or more PPR points, 4 of which were able to hit 30. There have been 4 30-point games against Houston in the last 6 games that the Texans have played. And Saquon Barkley's already been killing it. He is set up to absolutely smash. I had Josh Jacobs in the same spot on the heat map a couple weeks ago, and he went off for 3 touchdowns. Granted, he did have touchdown regression. He was number 1 on the, or he was very high on the touchdown regression cheat sheet as well. So Saquon, there's one guy in all of fantasy football that I would want over Saquon this week. All right, let's move on to Denver at Tennessee. Broncos at Titans. This game is the lowest over-under on the entire slate. It projects as a very ugly game that should be mostly avoided in fantasy football. It has a 38-point over-under. The Titans are favored by 3, which gives the Titans a implied total of just 20.5 points, which is in the lower half of the 28-team slate, even though they're favored to win the game. The Broncos have an implied point total of 17.5. So again, this game just sets up as one to mostly avoid in fantasy football. Now, again, I'm going to do another opinion thing, so close your ears, take this with a grain of salt. But I personally think with how weak and how vulnerable the Titans' defense is and has been, I think the Broncos have an opportunity to surprise coming out of the bye. So I think that the Broncos could put up more points than they're being given credit for already. But the one player that I was going to highlight here in this game is Courtland Sutton. Let me grab him real quick on the heat map. So Mr. Sutton, after 9 games... No, sorry. That was somebody else. After a night and day 7 games with Russell Wilson, Courtland Sutton is averaging 11.8 PPR points, 7.6 targets, 4.6 catches, 63.4 yards, and he has just 1 touchdown on the season. Once again, like those before him, Courtland Sutton is on the positive touchdown regression list. He has 472 yards, but just 1 touchdown. So he should be much closer to 2.9. So Courtland Sutton is actually relatively high on the touchdown regression list. Well, actually, he's in the middle of the pack. He comes in at about number 12 on the touchdown regression list, but he is on there. Courtland Sutton opened the season with 5 straight games between 11 and 20 PPR points. He was looking very solid, very consistent, and then all of a sudden he turned around and he put up 3 straight games under 6 PPR points, 2 of which were with Russell Wilson. There was 1 game in there that Russell Wilson didn't play. Now, this is a terrific matchup. They're coming off the bye week where theoretically they had some time to get right a little bit, which, a lot remains to be seen with Nathaniel Hackett at head coach. But the Tennessee Titans have been getting absolutely blowtorched by wide receivers. They are allowing the 4th most PPR points, 5th most catches, 6th most yards, and 2nd most touchdowns. 7 different wide receivers in 8 games have been able to reach 15 or more PPR points against the Tennessee Titans, 4 of which got past 23, including Stefon Diggs' volcanic eruption of 44.8 PPR points back in week 2. So the Titans have gotten smashed by wide receivers. Courtland Sutton is on the positive touchdown regression list. He's the name that if I had to pick somebody from this game, which again, it's one that I would mostly avoid. I think I got Pokemon on the brain. I've said evolved twice now there. But Courtland Sutton would be high on my list of players I want here. Obviously, there's guys like Derrick Henry, etc., that you're not going to bench. But Courtland Sutton is a name that if you're kind of on the fence about him this week, this is a week that I would like having him in my lineup. All right, let's go to the Colts at Raiders. This game has a 40.5 over-under. The Raiders are favored by 4.5 points, which gives them an implied total of 22.5, and the Colts only have an implied total of 18, which is in the bottom 5 in the league. This sets up as a game where Josh Jacobs should be fed as much as he can possibly handle as 4.5 point home favorites. And actually, Josh Jacobs is the player that I am going to zoom in on here for the purposes of today's episode. Found him in the heat map. So it's been 8 roller coaster games for Mr. Jacobs. He is, on the season, overall, he's averaging 19.1 PPR points, very strong. He's still getting 20.4 touches per game, which is very valuable. 3.8 targets, 3.1 catches, 114.4 scrimmage yards, and he has 6 touchdowns. Now, Josh Jacobs does have 3 games under 10 PPR points in just 8 tries. So 3 out of 8 games have been under 10 PPR points. Similarly, he's had 2 games that have been just between 11 and 15, which is fine, not great. But he has the 3 other games weren't just good; they were elite. They were league winning types of performances where he had 3 different volcanic eruptions of of games between 30 and 37 PPR points. So big, huge numbers for Josh Jacobs. Obviously, we see signs of low floors, but gigantic ceilings here. Now, he has scored under 12 PPR points in each of the last 2 games, but before that was the stretch where he rattled off 3 straight 30-plus PPR point games. He is again, home-favored running back, which implies he should get plenty of volume. He won't get scripted out of this game like he has been recently. He's on a team that's expected to score a healthy amount of points, which implies scoring chances. And he's in a favorable matchup. So Josh Jacobs getting plenty of volume, good matchup. He is a RB1 with some upside this week. The Colts have held running backs to the 9th fewest touchdowns at just 0.7 per game. But other than that, they have allowed the 13th most. Oh, speaking of that touchdowns, I got one note real quick on that I'll get to in a second. But the Colts have allowed the 13th most PPR points, the 2nd most touches, the 8th most catches, 16th most rushing yards, 6th most receiving yards, and the 10th most scrimmage yards. Now, back to the touchdown thing. They have allowed the 9th fewest, or held running backs to the 9th fewest touchdowns at just 0.7 per game. But one other thing that I do on this touchdown regression cheat sheet that I put together for my subscribers is I actually put together a team-specific regression list, which is a little bit too unique to what you might find in this space. So I put together a team regression list that shows which defenses are mathematically most likely or least likely to give up touchdowns to certain positions. So the Colts are one of the few names on that list for running backs. They have allowed 1,241 scrimmage yards to running backs, but they've only allowed 6 touchdowns on the year. On average, teams that have allowed a similar scrimmage yards this year to running backs have given up 9.9 touchdowns. So the Colts are about 3.9 touchdowns behind where they quote-unquote should be to this point. So Josh Jacobs himself isn't exactly a touchdown regression candidate, but the Colts make the list as a team that's quote-unquote due to start giving up more touchdowns sooner rather than later. By the way, 5 different running backs in 9 games have been able to reach 15 PPR points against the Colts, including 1 in each of the last 3 games. So they're definitely showing signs of cracks to running backs. All right, let's hop over to the Saints and the Steelers. We want to talk about Mr. Chris Olave here, but before we do, let's talk about the game. It has an over-under of 40 points. The Saints are favored by just 1.5, so it's projected to be a very close game in Pittsburgh. Very low over-under. 40 is, I believe, tied for, let me look here. Yep, it's oh, no, not even tied. 40 points is the second lowest over-under on the 14-game slate. The Saints are expected to score just 20.75 points, but they're expected to win. And the Steelers are expected to score 19.25 points. So it should be a close game. It should be pretty ugly, a game to mostly avoid in fantasy football, but there's a few bright spots, one of which is one of my favorite plays on the entire Week 10 slate, and that's Chris Olave. So in 5 games with Andy Dalton, Chris Olave is averaging 14.6 PPR points, 8.6 targets, 5.2 catches, 70 yards, and he has 2 touchdowns. Now on the season, Olave has 618 yards, but just 2 touchdowns. Once again, going back to the touchdown regression cheat sheet, Chris Olave comes in 5th place on the touchdown regression cheat sheet with 618 yards, but just 2 touchdowns, where on average, running backs and wide receivers with similar yardage counts have about 4.1 touchdowns, and he has just 2. So he's pretty high on the touchdown regression list at 5th. Olave has 10 or more PPR points in all 5 of the games he's played with Andy Dalton. He has yet to exceed 17.6 because he's not quite scoring. I'm treating Olave as a wide receiver 2 with regression and matchup boosted upside in this one because the Steelers have been getting absolutely shredded by wide receivers. They're allowing the 2nd most PPR points, 6th most catches, the most yards, and the most touchdowns. They are allowing 1.6 touchdowns per game and 212.9 yards per game to wide receivers. 10 different wide receivers in 8 games have been able to put up 15 or more PPR points on these Steelers. Let me say that again. 10 wide receivers in just 8 games. So more than one wide receiver per game is getting at least 15 or more PPR points against these Pittsburgh Steelers. 6 of them, 6 in 8 games, have been able to score 23 or more, including volcanic eruptions by Gabe Davis, who had 32.1, and A.J. Brown, who had 39.6, both of those performances came within the last 4 games. So the Steelers are leaking 2 wide receivers, and they're doing it recently. Hopping over to the Vikings at Bills. If you haven't heard by now, which I'm sure you have, Josh Allen is going to miss this game. Of course, the Vikings get lucky, and they get the Vikings without Josh Allen. So annoying, so frustrating. But here we are. Packer fan bias. Okay. The game itself, as of right now, these numbers could change a bit. They already have, but the game itself has a 43.5 over/under, which is about middle of the pack. The Bills have the Bills are still favored by 3.5 points. They have an implied total of 23.5, which obviously looks a lot different without Josh Allen. And the Vikings have an implied total of 20 points. So all in all, this should be a relatively close game. Neutral game script. Both teams should be able to execute the way they want to, theoretically. The name that I want to highlight here is one and only Mr. Stefon Diggs. This one's going to be a fun one. So, I'm skipping through some of the things I wrote because at the time of writing this, it wasn't clear yet whether or not Josh Allen was going to play, but he has since been ruled out. So I'm skipping down to the analysis part regarding Case Keenum. The Bills are expected to score 23.5 points, which is the 8th most on the 28-team slate. Now, there's reasons for... obviously, when you think about the Buffalo Bills, you want to come down on their players significantly, right? It's not Josh Allen. There's no way of sugarcoating that. There's no way that's a good thing. But there are reasons for optimism, especially when it comes to Stefon Diggs. So, if you'll recall... or if you don't know this by now, Buffalo's backup quarterback that will be starting this week is Mr. Case Keenum. And if you recall, back in 2017, Mr. Case Keenum and Stefon Diggs played in the NFC Championship game together. They played 14 games together that year in 2017, and in those 14 games, Stefon Diggs still averaged 14.9 PPR points, 7.5 targets, 5 catches, 68.5 yards, and he had 7 touchdowns. Okay, obviously those numbers are lower than what we expect, but that just goes to show how great Stefon Diggs is, that the guy still averaged 14.9 PPR points, and that feels quote-unquote low for Stefon Diggs. In those 14 games, Diggs finished under 8 PPR points in 4 of 14 games. He finished between 11 and 19 PPR points in 8 of 14 games, and he finished above 25 twice, including a 37.3 point game with Case Keenum. Now, he obviously may not be the obviously elite wide receiver one that we're used to seeing without Josh Allen, but Stefon Diggs is still a very solid, he's on that wide receiver 1-2 line, probably better treated as a high-end wide receiver 2, but he is in a great matchup against his former team, and I'm sure Case Keenum and Stefon Diggs would love nothing more than to drop a touchdown or 2 on both of their former squad that they went to the NFC Championship game with together. Now, the Vikings themselves, as a defense, they're getting destroyed by wide receivers. They're allowing the sixth most PPR points, 7th most catches, 3rd most yards, 9th most touchdowns, and 8 different wide receivers in 8 games have been able to drop 15 or more PPR points on the Vikings, 5 of which have been in the last 3 games. So there have been 5 wide receivers in the last 3 games that have been able to hit 15 or more PPR points. So I get it. Josh Allen's not in the game. That's a downgrade to all Buffalo Bills skill players, but this isn't a reason or a week to consider doing something silly like benching Stefon Diggs. The light is still on there. All right, let's hop over to the Cowboys-Packers, and I'm laughing here because I look at my notes, and I wrote Zeke, I guess, Aaron Jones, blech. This game is gross. I hated writing this game up from a fantasy football standpoint. I hated writing it up from a Packers, as a Packer fan, I hated writing this up. I hate the idea of Mike McCarthy coming to Lambeau and beating Aaron Rodgers and Matt LaFleur. It's going to sting so much when it happens, but I promised you one player from each game, so let's do it. The game has a 43-point over-under, which is on the lower side. Dallas is favored by 4, giving them an implied total of 23.5. And then the Packers, man, in this Aaron Rodgers era, are implied for just 19.5 points, which is getting close to the bottom of the 28-team slate. It's a 4-point game, relatively neutral script. Honestly, with really strong defenses from a fantasy standpoint on both sides, this is a game to mostly avoid more than it is one to target. Obviously, you start your studs, but the name that I guess I will zoom in on in this one is Ezekiel Elliott. And to be clear, I don't necessarily love him in this game, but the point of this episode is to give you one player that I can at least tolerate, and I can definitely tolerate Zeke here. I think there's reason for optimism. After 7 games, Zeke is averaging 11.1 PPR points, 16.4 touches, 1.1 targets, 0.9 catches, 67.9 scrimmage yards, and he has 4 touchdowns. Now, in those 7 games, Zeke has landed between 15 and 18 PPR points in each of the last 2 games. But, of course, in the 5 games before that, Zeke failed to hit 15 PPR points even once, and he landed under 8 PPR points 3 times in 5 games. So, obviously, pretty scary floor here, and he hasn't been the Zeke that we used to know. But still, as a favored running back on a team that's expected to score a decent amount of points, Zeke does remain a volume-based running RB2. And the Packers have been a mediocre matchup for running backs with some pros and cons to exploit, some pros to exploit, some cons to shy away from. On the one hand, they are holding running backs to the 15th fewest PPR points per game, the 6th fewest catches, the 12th fewest receiving yards, and the 6th fewest touchdowns, which we'll come back to in a second. Actually, no, let's just cover it now. 6th fewest touchdowns at 0.6 per game. Now, the Packers pop up on that touchdown regression list in a gigantic way, in the biggest way, as far as teams go. So as far as defending running backs go, the Packers have allowed 1,360 scrimmage yards, but they've held running backs to just 5 touchdowns. On average, teams with a similar yardage count of around 1,300 scrimmage yards, on average, teams have given up 9.9 touchdowns to this point on the season. The Packers have given up 5, so they are about half to where they are, quote-unquote, supposed to be in terms of touchdowns that they've allowed. Now, on the continuously bright side, when facing the Packers, they are allowing the 6th most touches, they're allowing the 3rd most rushing yards, and they're allowing the 4th most scrimmage yards. 5 running backs in 9 games have been able to reach 15 PPR points against the Packers. Now, there hasn't been much of a ceiling, as just 1 has hit 20. But again, the idea is that the light is on for Zeke. I know he's gross, I know he's ugly, but if you're in a pinch and you're finding yourself in a spot where you feel like you need to start Zeke this week, there are worse weeks to do it for sure. This is a mighty fine week to get Zeke in your lineup. All right, let's get away from this disgusting game. Quick pause. Get a drink of the chocolate peanut butter. All right, let's hop over. Cardinals at Rams. Another gross game. This game has a 40.5 over-under, which is tied for the 3rd lowest on the slate. It's going to be a close game, according to Vegas. The Rams are favored by 1.5 at home, so it's a very neutral game script. Both teams will, quote-unquote, play their style of offense. The Cardinals have an implied total of 19.5. The Rams have an implied total of 21. The player that I wanted to highlight here was Tyler Higbee, of all players. So finding him on the map here real quick. Now, after 8 games, Tyler Higbee is averaging, on the season, he's averaging 8.4 PPR points, 7.1 targets, 4.5 catches, 39 yards, and he has no touchdowns. Now, once again, hopping over to the regression cheat sheet, Higbee having no touchdowns actually has him in 6th on the touchdown regression cheat sheet. He has 312 yards, no touchdowns. On average, he should have, quote-unquote, somewhere around 2.1 touchdowns to his resume, and he has 0. So he's pretty high on the touchdown regression cheat sheet. It's been a tale of 2 seasons for Tyler Higbee, and he's trending in a downward spiral. He's a very uncomfortable start at this point. The first several games he averaged 9.6 targets, 6.6 catches, 58 yards, 12.4 PPR points, and that was all over the first 5 games. He was a legitimate tight end 1. He was producing very well for his fantasy managers. And then in the last 3 games, he's averaging 3 targets, 1 catch, 7.33 yards, and 1.7 PPR points over his last 3 games. To put this all another way, he finished between 10 and 18 PPR points in 4 straight games between weeks 2 and 5, but then he fell under 4 PPR points in 3 straight games since then, including last week's big fat 0. He's caught 0 passes last week. So, yeah, he's really tough to trust this point. It's hard to stomach putting Tyler Higbee into your fantasy football lineup, but he is absolutely on the streaming radar this week as a positive touchdown regression candidate, and he gets the best possible matchup that a tight end can get against a league worst Cardinals defense that is hemorrhaging the most PPR points, most catches, second most yards, and third most touchdowns. 7 different tight ends in 9 games have been able to hit 10 or more PPR points against the Cardinals. 4 of them have hit 17, 2 of which have crossed over 20. All right, let's hop over to the Chargers 49ers Sunday night football game. Almost at the end here. He says 41 minutes into the episode. So Chargers at 49ers, 45.5 over under, which is pretty healthy. That is we're about the 5th highest on the 14-game slate. Now, the 49ers are favored by 7. Chargers not catching a lot of love here. 49ers are favored by 7, putting their implied total at 26.3, which is the 3rd highest on the entire slate. And then you got the Chargers with an implied total of 19.25. Now, again, personally, grain of salt. I should get like a salt shaker down here that I can throw, but take this with a grain of salt because this is just my personal opinion. But I feel like the Chargers aren't getting enough love. It seems like they'll be able to score more than 19 points. And I know the 49ers have a great defense, but anyway, the player that I have to highlight here is the one player that I would take over Saquon Barkley this week, and it is Christian McCaffrey. And I know he's going to be in your lineup regardless, but he needs to be talked about in terms of how insane the setup for this week is. He checks every single box. The only box that he doesn't check is being a touchdown regression candidate. He's not one. But CMC played 81% of the snaps in week 8. He racked up a volcanic 34.9 PPR points on 26 touches, which included 8 catches on 9 targets for 149 yards and 2 touchdowns. Then they went on bye so he could get even more familiar with the playbook. Now they are 7-point home favorites, so the CMC should get plenty of volume. They're expected to score a lot of points, the 3rd most points on the slate, so CMC should get plenty of scoring opportunities. And if that wasn't enough, and if being Christian McCaffrey wasn't enough, he gets a mouth-watering, drool-inducing matchup against the Chargers. The Chargers are holding running backs to the 10th fewest receiving yards, which we know CMC can change by himself, but they're holding running backs to the 10th fewest receiving yards. But other than that, they are getting absolutely dunked on by running backs. They are hemorrhaging the 2nd most PPR points, 10th most touches, 15th most catches, 2nd most rushing yards, 2nd most scrimmage yards, and 2nd most touchdowns. They're allowing 1.5 touchdowns every game. They have allowed 6 different running backs in 8 games to produce 15 or more PPR points, including 4 different running backs that have been able to hit 20. Christian McCaffrey is the unquestioned RB1. He's the top play on the entire Week 10 slate. And Saquon Barkley I thought was going to be once I saw he's playing the Texans. But it's CMC, Saquon, and then a large drop-off to whoever's next. Last game, let's talk Commanders-Eagles. This game has a 44-point over-under. The Eagles are favored by a whopping 11, which is the widest spread, the widest margin on the Week 10 slate. The Eagles are expected to score around 27.5 points. The Commanders' implied total is 16.5 points, which This means Vegas is expecting the Eagles to be able to control this game relatively easily with their rushing attack. Let their defense win this game. Miles Sanders is the name to highlight here once I find him on the old heat map. All right, so Mr. Miles Sanders. So after 8 games, Mr. Sanders is averaging 14.6 PPR points, 17.8 touches, 1.6 targets, 1.4 catches, 87.3 scrimmage yards, and he has 6 touchdowns after not scoring any touchdowns all of last year. He's been all over the place with his PPR outputs, admittedly. He has scored less than 9 PPR points in 2 of 8 games. He scored between 11 and 15 points in 3 of 8 games. And he scored between 15 and 19 points in 2 of 8 games. And he has a high of 29.6, which he was able to get to back in week 4. What's working in Miles Sanders' favor this week is that the Eagles are heavy, heavy home favorites, which implies volume, right? 11-point home favorites. There should be plenty of volume for Miles Sanders. He's on a team that's expected to score a lot of points, which implies scoring chances. And Miles Sanders, I'm treating this week as a high-end RB2, despite what looks like a tough on-paper matchup. Now, the Commanders, they've been holding running backs. They've been pretty tough on running backs. They're holding them to the 13th fewest PPR points, 5th fewest touches, 3rd fewest catches, 10th fewest rushing yards, 8th fewest receiving yards, and 7th fewest scrimmage yards. Now, on the optimistic side, if we're looking for one, the Commanders are allowing the 7th most running back touchdowns at 1.1 per game, the 7th most running back touchdowns in football. Even still, just 4 running backs in 9 games have been able to reach 15 PPR points against these Commanders, but everything sets up well for Miles Sanders to get every chance and every opportunity to perform, and I like the idea of using him in cash leagues in DFS, FanDuel, DraftKings, etc. All right. That is a wrap on today's episode. He says 46 minutes into the episode. I'm going to finish this beer, play a little bit of Pokemon, I think, then hit the hay. But that's going to do it on today's episode. By the way, if you like this kind of analysis, all 250 plus of my subscribers are getting what we just talked about, that heat map. They're getting every heat map from me every single week, along with every touchdown regression cheat sheet, a streamer cheat sheet, which we didn't even talk about. It's a quarterback, tight end, defense and kicker streamer cheat sheet, which helps you find those, bye-week and injury rentals when you need to find somebody to plug and play into your lineup. They get weekly rankings every single week, and they get access to our live member community, which is a Discord channel filled with 250 plus active subscribers that are dedicated to helping each other win and frankly being friends. There's been some fun relationships built over there. Now, being part of that Discord community means you're also getting live alerts and notifications from me sent right to your phone. So when injuries happen, when news breaks, I'm able to hit your phone immediately with something that's recommends something for you to do, like today. Hey, Josh Allen's out, go pick up Case Keenum. I actually sent that alert out before it was announced Josh Allen was out because I noticed that the Bills' implied total had dropped by 4 points. So you'll get live recommendations sent to your phone, and every Monday and Friday at noon Central, we do a live Ask Me Anything sessions where you can bring your specific start-sit questions, or who do I trade, who do I add, who do I drop, who should I submit a waiver claim, etc. So this whole package that I've been rambling about, that my 250 plus subscribers, they're getting from me every single week. They're getting all of that. The heat map, the community, the regression cheat sheet, the streamer cheat sheet, weekly rankings, live recommendations, ask me anything. And it costs one of these per month, one beer. $5.69 because all of my prices end in 69. Nice. Yes, I need to grow up. $5.69 per month. And you're getting all of that. And this stuff takes me 30 plus hours per week. So 40 plus hours per week. So yeah, it's 19 cents per day, if that's an easier way to look at it. And that's it. That's a wrap on today's episode. Episode 21. Done. That is a wrap. I'll be back on Tuesday with episode 22, which is going to be my typical, let's call it waiver wire episode, but really it's a list of players for you to consider adding both before and after waivers run. That's what makes it unique. It's a list of players to consider adding after waivers run, as well as the ones to consider putting a claim in. But check back on Tuesday for episode 22, which is going to be that waiver article. Until then, please, please, please take 69 seconds to like, subscribe, rate, review the show, and please, if you'd be so kind as to share this with one person, one family member, one friend. Maybe you hated this episode and you think I suck, so you want your league mates to have access to sucky advice. Share it with them. That'd be great. Until then, please, again, like, rate, subscribe, review, share with one friend, and again, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for being here. If you're still here after 50 minutes, about to be 51 minutes, I really appreciate you being here. You guys, you have no idea what you're doing for a guy's confidence, for his dream, his passion, and really the value that's in his life. You're helping a guy live doing what he loves every single day, and I can't thank you enough for that. Thank you so much for being here. Cheers. This brew, this chocolate coffee peanut butter porter, and these heat maps, this brew is for you. Cheers.